Hey, what's up, YouTube? I'm Nick Villalon, National Brand Ambassador for the Macallan.
And I'm Sniff from ScotchNSniff. And today we're going to be sitting here talking about the Masters collection.
Yeah, the 1824 Masters series, which we launched now a few years ago. Everything started off with the Macallan Rare Cask, which at this point you can find in any high-end whiskey retailer. This is top of the line when it comes to our core range expressions of the Macallan, and then the rest of them are top of the line when it comes to the collection that you can find in most good quality whiskey retailers as well. This is a series that we launched obviously in honor of the foundation of the Macallan back in 1824. And what it does is that it showcases the scarcity of liquid, of cask that we can use for each of those specific expressions.
I'm glad you said that, because a lot of times people see these in the store and they just see price tags because it's hard not to see them. And a lot of times people are like, there's no way that the whiskey, I was literally in a store the other day where they had the M and it was $5,000 in the store, and people were like, oh my gosh, what else will this whiskey do for me? And it's like, I don't think that's what this is about.
No, exactly. It's sometimes you transcend just what the whiskey is as a liquid, and you look a little bit more at the investment of time and resources that goes into achieving that specific expression. And when you know a little bit more about the story behind it, things starts to make a lot more sense. Now, needless to say, this is not necessarily the type of whiskey that everybody's going to have in their cabinet at home to open up on a Tuesday night. But for people who are big fans of Scotch whiskey, as well as history, then you start getting into the artistic and romantic side of what whiskey has to offer. And the value after that is decided by whoever is purchasing the whiskey ultimately. So,
of course, I mean, that's always who decides the value, really, because people have arguments all the time about what a whiskey's worth, what a whiskey's not worth. And it comes down to, a combination of what you can afford and what you would like to drink.
Absolutely. It's a very subjective matter, really. If you look at stamp collections, right? No one would take one of those stamps and put it on an envelope to send out. And then you look at the value that some of those stamps actually have, and it's absolutely mind-boggling. Like, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars for some of them. So this is, we fall in that realm of scarce and rare products, as well as craftsmanship of the highest level.
It's funny you say stamp collections, because I remember as a kid collecting stamps, and then you see there was some like upside down plain stamp that's worth like a ridiculous amount of money. And as a kid, you just get excited because you're like, I'm going to find that stamp and it's going to be mine. But as an adult, you're like, well, there's good whiskey out there.
There's good whiskey out there, exactly. So yeah, if we go back to the series, it starts with the Macallan Rare Cask over here. Now, this specific expression of the Macallan is something that we achieve over the course of 18 months, just about, which is how long it takes our master whiskey maker to visit all the warehouses, go through all of the casks, and assess their maturity. Now, we have about 280,000 casks at the Macallan. So that means that our whiskey making team will go through roughly 400 to 500 different cask samples every single day.
Okay, so there's a whole team. It's not just Bob Delgarno going out and getting drunk every day.
So Bob overlooks the full production, but let's be honest here. He does most of his work with his nose.
Of course, of course.
So making whiskey is mostly an art of the nose. And so he also cuts down the whiskey about half of its cask strength before he noses it and assess the quality of the whiskey and the maturity.
That's something that... who is it? Richard Patterson, the nose also does. Like, they talk about bringing it all down to 20%.
Yep.
I think most people would call that blasphemy in whiskey because it's less than 40 at least. But that's just interesting that it's so much nosing. Yeah, that's what David Stewart called himself, a master noser, not a master blender or a master whiskey maker, but a master noser. So.
I think that's a brilliant way to put it, because the subtleties that the nose is able to pick up on is one of the rare senses of the human being that hasn't been replicated or made better by technology. So this is why those master whiskey makers are actually so well recognized in their craft and are such a special talent, is because their nose goes even further beyond what the usual nose, like mine or yours, although you're called Sniff, so your nose is actually pretty good. But what they're able to pick up in the whiskey as they cut it down becomes absolutely mind-boggling, and they do it fast too. I had the chance to work with Bob on replicating our 12-year-old double cask expression one day when I was at the distillery, and the speed at which he would analyze each of the sample is absolutely phenomenal. By the time I was done smelling my very first sample, he had 30 to 40 set aside.
Wow.
And he was like, this is what we're going to use to make this expression.
Wow.
So it's very, very fast because they've really perfected kind of that side of their craft. So he goes through the 400, 500 cask sample, and he overlooks everything. So he works with a team, but everything goes through him currently. And he chooses from the widest variety of sherry casks that we've ever used to make a single Macallan. So the goal with Macallan Rare Cask is to use a very small percentage of our total inventory, far less than 1%. On average, it can vary anywhere from 1,000 to 1,200 casks a year that are set aside and labeled as rare cask. So it's a very small percentage, and within that inventory is going to have upwards of 16 different cask types. Casks that are going to vary in size, in types of oak, number of usage, which types of sherry actually season the oak. And so using that wide variety of sherry cask is able to create those layers upon layers of flavor in this specific expression.
So because they're picking that out every year, there's going to be a difference per year. It's almost going to be like batches.
Exactly. Actually, we start seeing on the shelf the vintage of bottling as well as the batch number on Macallan Rare Cask. So this is something new that started arriving late in 2017 with batch number 1 of 2017. Now we're seeing a little bit of batch number 2, and we should see the first batch of 2018, which will be batch number 3.
Very cool. So people can buy them, compare them.
It's going to be easier to put them side by side and compare and find those micro differences.
Yeah.
You know, you're never going to see a wide difference from one expression to the other, but you're going to see small differences because it is a human process to make whiskey. So it's not perfect every year. Even the master whiskey maker's nose and palate evolves through the year. So it's very interesting to see that progression of his senses as he perfects his craft.
It's very cool.
Yeah.
You guys do use computers also though, right? I've heard of something like, so when I went to Macallan, you guys have like just a wide swath of all kinds of technology and like spectrum analyzers to figure out what's in the whiskey from a scientific standpoint, just from the molecules.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's this analysis that's definitely made. A lot of it is on the distillation side of things. So perfecting distillation was a key at making better whiskey today than we've ever done before. And I think most distilleries can say the same thing as they're perfecting their craft. Then after that, when you make the whiskey, when we analyze the whiskey, a lot of it's going to be for the color of the whiskey, as Macallan is naturally colored. So having that consistency of color, we use those tools because we don't have the caramel additives that we can put in there to achieve that consistency. So we need a little bit of help on that side because going for natural color just makes making whiskey that much harder in order to achieve that consistency.
I want to apologize to everybody instantly and right now. Just this is going to be a really nerdy episode of ScotchNSniff. Just I can't help it. Like if you go to the distillery, most of the people from Macallan actually are a bunch of like biochemists and like all kinds of bioengineers, just a bunch of nerdy folks making good product.
Yeah, like our new master distiller, Nick Savage.
Yep.
Who's a bioengineer, absolutely. But then you go into the warehouses and then you have that classic Scottish hospitality because those people are so passionate about their craft. You walk in there and you could be walking, you know, into a Scottish farm and people have kind of that same approach. Salt of the earth, really committed to their craft, and the hospitality is second to none.
It's awesome.
Getting back to Rare Cask, so what we have here is a whiskey that's predominantly aged in first fill European oak sherry cask, although we do find a little bit of second fill and a little bit of European oak. It's going to use sherry butts, which is the classic cask we use at the Macallan to mature a whiskey, as well as hogshead, which is half the size at 250 liter, and sherry puncheons, which are the same volume as a sherry butt, but are smaller, a bit more squat, so the head of the cask has a bit more surface of contact with the liquid. And you can tell the color here is that deep mahogany, absolutely beautiful, rich color. The whiskey is going to be that classic signature, luxurious nose of a Macallan. You get all those sherry notes, that nice dried fruit element, a little bit of the chocolate, the spices. The finish is extremely long, and the complexity of the whiskey is really what gets you. Every sip is a little different from the previous one. Makes for a fantastic experience.
Well, if you have enough sips, it's going to taste like something completely different.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you have a nice big smile on your face. The second expression in that lineup is called Macallan Reflexion. So this one was named after the reflection of the whiskey. So once again, circling back to that natural color element that makes the Macallan so special. As we know, most distilleries actually use caramel coloring in their final product. So it's always been something that kind of sets us apart at the Macallan. Now, we're kind of moving up that, what I like to call that pyramid of scarcity here. For each expression as we move up, the number of casks that we can use to make it becomes more restrained, making for a whiskey that's harder to reproduce and that's that much rarer in terms of size of batches. So with the Macallan Reflexion, what we do here is that we move onto fully first fill European oak and American oak sherry cask, but what we predominantly use this times are sherry hogsheads. Okay. So those smaller 250 liter casks. That's extremely important because we really don't fill that many of the hogshead at the Macallan. The reason behind that is the fact that we never use our casks more than twice. So the cask is always of the highest quality, very rich. And a smaller cask like a hogshead will intensify that surface of contact between the wood and the whiskey, therefore making that maturation process that much faster.
Yeah.
Now, especially for the European oak cask, that's going to give a lot of flavor to the whiskey in a very short amount of time. The thing is, once again, looking at this color, the whiskey has that very deep kind of sherry color to it. You see a lot of Oloroso sherries or PX sherries that will have that darker, almost reddish hue to them, like ruby. To achieve that, we have to find those perfect casks that are stable enough in terms of their interaction between the wood and the whiskey to age for the periods of time that are necessary to achieve this complexity of a whiskey. Now, this one is quite surprising. On the nose, it's quite soft. Lots of floral element, lots of fresh fruit, a bit of citrus is in there. But then on the palate, that intensity of the flavor comes through.
Definitely.
This is when you start getting a lot of those chocolate, a little bit of that coffee. That's all intermingled with those lighter notes as well, coming from the American oak. Fantastic whiskey, really showcases a unique side of the Macallan. That's that full spectrum of flavor that we're able to achieve in the whiskeys using the cask that we do. Now, the next whiskey up is...
Oh, no. I have to do this.
Sorry, I thought you were...
So the Reflection's actually... So these two bottles I actually have at home, and like the Reflection's a funny one. I opened it up for a birthday, and actually the guy behind the camera there, Jason, took it over to his house. We had a bunch of people over, and it was weird because a lot of us talked about how it had a lot of those bourbony notes. Yeah. And hearing that the oak that you guys used was American oak... Yeah. In those puncheons, like that's really interesting because a lot of that really does carry through, and you're right, like floral on the nose, but very, very alive. Absolutely. When it comes to the palate.
Well, one thing I like about that, the usage of American oak sherry cask is that for Macallan, it's really reverting back to our sources. In the past 30 to 40 years, just about, it's really the European oak sherry cask that kind of became that classic Macallan style. But before that, most of the sherry cask that we would get would be made out of American oak.
That's ironic because I find myself gravitating more towards the European oak Macallan. So for me, tasting like the cask strength or tasting the older 18s, like to me, that's like the signature flavor. And some of the newer ones, like the classic cut, are like not really in my wheelhouse, as it were. But some people like ginger. No, absolutely. It's funny that you mentioned that because a lot of people, when you talk about American oak or European oak, it's going to be a very polarizing subject. Yeah. And that's true for every distillery. You see it all the time as people prefer one style over the other. And it just goes to show that taste is something that's very subjective, once again, hard to compare. I like to make the comparison between white wine and red wine. You'd be hard pressed to say that one is better than the other in terms of quality. It's just a different flavor profile. It's like peated and non-peated. Absolutely. I know a guy that has a very, very specific opinion on the topic. I mean, that's why we skipped the whole Rare Cask Black, because do we really need to talk about Macallan doing something so abhorrent as eating a whiskey? It's a very, very rare expression. And that's, once again, you're going down that scarcity pyramid with even less cask. You're right around only 100 casks per batches that will make the cut in order to be selected from to make Rare Cask Black. And it has some of that very rare peated Macallan into it. But yeah, very hard to come by, and it's a whiskey that you find in the global travel retail that even I haven't had the chance to come across very often in my career, a few times, but it's not my go-to whiskey at home, let's say. The original Rare Cask goes down much faster. Let's just put it that way. Now this one actually gets back to your classic style. It's the first fill European oak sherry cask made at the Tavasa cooperage down in Jerez de la Frontera. This is Macallan number 6, and it's your quintessential Macallan. Bob Delgarno himself, our master whiskey maker, admitted that this was his favorite whiskey in the lineup. It happens to be my favorite whiskey in the lineup, and I think it might be. You have a little bit of a soft spot for it in your heart. Now, this one is called number 6 because that's the 6th pillar of the Macallan's philosophy of whiskey making, and it represents the Macallan itself. It's the Peerless Spirit. This is what Bob describes as the whiskey he dreams of when he dreams about Macallan. So as I said, first fill European oak sherry cask coming from the Tavasa cooperage. Those are the only casks that can be selected from to make this whiskey. And you look at it, and here you're really in the deep ruby colors. The whiskey is absolutely dark. You can barely see through it. It looks literally like sherry. And actually, because it's not really a whiskey show without a bit of whiskey, made sure that we had a little bit to sip on here of the Macallan number 6. It's a very nice glass. Absolutely. I mean, if you're going to have some quality whiskey, you need to have the proper glassware to enjoy it, right? It's a little bit of a ScotchNSniff glassware here. I'm sure they can find it somewhere. Yeah, we don't have to talk about that. I mean, there will be links down in the description below. You know how those things go. Just like a little shameless plug. Yeah, cheers. Can't help it. I know we can't nose it forever. I'm just going to sit here and nose it until forever.
I don't know if you remember the first time we enjoyed this together at our first event, but to me, it's really the texture of this whiskey that strikes you at very first. You know, Macallan is known to have those very oily, creamy styles of whiskey because of the small stills that we use for distillation, some of the smallest ones in Scotland. And this whiskey is the perfect example of that. You can literally chew on this one. The texture is phenomenal. And then it's all dark chocolate, red fruit. You get those brandied cherries, those figs, a little bit of stone fruits in there.
The figs and the dried fruit.
Oh, yeah.
It's perfect.
And then on the finish, everything balances out with those oaky tannins. Once again, that bitter dark chocolate and those spices that give it that long-lasting finish. The whiskey just doesn't stop going. This is my favorite Macallan I've ever had the chance of trying. I have a reservation about calling it my favorite whiskey because I truly believe that your favorite whiskey is one that you should be able to enjoy, at your leisure.
I believe.
But it's definitely a highlight and a standalone for me.
And you said these come, what type of casks were used in this?
First fill European oak sherry butts coming from the Tevasa.
So
cooperage.
Tevasa, weren't those the same type of casks? Were those also used in the edition number 1?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do find some of the Tevasa cask in the edition number 1. It's the classic Macallan cask. So those are the ones where we get most of our European oak sherry casks from. But needless to say, the first fill casks are rather rare because you use them once and then a maximum of 2 times at Macallan. So it's not like we have a lot of those just laying around. And once again, going up that pyramid of scarcity of rarer cask that we can use to make this specific expression.
I mean, we could do a whole video literally on how you guys make your
cask
cask alone. Like that,
Well,
that
yeah.
was a daunting thing to hear from Nicolas when me and my brother were being like walked around. She walked us around and then like told us like exactly how you guys make all of your casks and how like going to Spain, how you guys go to the same bodega and how you guys actually have the wood sitting out and drying instead of kiln drying and the entire process and how long it takes.
It's a process that's a little bit mind-boggling in today's day and age of whiskey making where people are going crazy about single malt scotch. And this process is really something that slows the whole process down. But for us, it's something that we're not willing to compromise on, only because up to 80% of the flavor of our whiskey comes from those exceptional exceptional casks. So if we were to compromise on that, we would jeopardize the whole production of whiskey, which is really something we're not willing to do. It's actually one of our pride to be able to say that we own the cask making process from start to finish. We're the only distillery, as far as I know, in Scotland that will ship oak from America overseas to southern Spain to actually make their sherry casks. It's something that's actually quite special. A lot of people will get their American oak sherry cask from us after we use them a few times. And we've been dealing with the same cooperages down there for decades at this point. So it's a process that we've perfected, and we have Stuart McPherson, our master of wood, that actually overlooks that production to make sure that we only have the highest quality casks that come into our distillery.
It's perfect. So good.
And then this lineup finishes with Macallan M. Now, a lot of whiskey ask me, how is number 6 your favorite one and not M? It's the top of the line. It's one of your rarest whiskeys you've ever made at the Macallan. And the reason behind that for me is because Macallan M simply is not whiskey. At this point, it's liquid history. Absolutely.
Felt that coming.
This is something that's quite special. And it's something that I use all the time to describe this whiskey. But to be quite honest with you, in the 4 or 5 years that I've been describing it, I've never found better words to actually tell people about exactly what they have in this bottle. Now, this whiskey can sometimes take over 2 years for our master whiskey maker to select the perfect casks that will go into there. 7 different casks, some of which date back to the Second World War era. So to me, to think back to what was happening at that time, when in 1942 Scotland entered Second World War, and the first thing that happens is that their whiskey warehouses got bombarded because the enemies thought that it was ammunitions or weapons. Yeah. Turns out it was way worse than that. It was the very precious whiskey. And so having whiskey that survived that era is something that's quite special. So most of the casks that are used in these bottling actually date back to that era. And that after that, going up a few decades, 1960s, 1970s, and typically the youngest whiskey will be somewhere around the 1990s for this specific expression. I think the largest batch of M we've ever produced was about 2,700 bottles. So it's a very small production for the world. And just like number 6, beautifully housed in a handmade Lily Cristal decanter, absolutely. You know, when Bob takes so much time to select the cask and create those whiskeys, it's important for him that they're housed in a decanter that perfectly showcases every single dimension of it. So the Cristal is perfect to showcase that natural color as well as the depth of the hue that you find in the whiskey. Very, very special stuff. Now, back in the Second World War, Macallan was forced into using peat in their malting process because all the wood and charcoal was actually allocated to our efforts.
So they can make steel, obviously.
Absolutely. And so we were using peat as our source of fuel in order to malt our whiskey. And so you're going to have a very slight hint of smokiness in this, but it's not your classic smokiness.
Right.
Don't go ahead and think Isla whiskeys here. That's not at all where we are. It's very, very small parts per million content, and especially since the smokiness of the whiskey tends to disintegrate as you age it for long periods of time. And so at this point, it's a faint smokiness that's in the back, and a lot of that smoke actually evolved in different flavors. You start getting a lot of that leather, that tobacco leaf, a little bit of that truffle as well in there, making for a whiskey that's absolutely unique. It also doesn't have that typical Macallan texture. This one is a little bit more like a cloud of flavor. It touches your tongue and just evaporates. It's a cloud that takes over your whole palate. The flavors just hit everywhere at once. And that finish is very hard to describe because it's so complex that everybody experiences it differently. Yeah, it's a very singular experience.
All right, so for everybody who is not looking at the 1824 collection for like their immediate, I mean, maybe like the Rare Cask for like special occasions, for the rest of us who are like regular people, what are there any other options that we can have where we can have this type of attention to detail, but maybe not this type of attention to price?
Yeah, absolutely. At Macallan, what we have is also another limited range of whiskeys that will be one-offs on specific years or very limited in release. A good example of that is the Edition series, which is released every year, and the box showcases the full cask makeup that was actually used in there. So lots of information for the people that like to do a deeper dive into what went into making that specific whiskey come to life. We also have here on the back other ones of our limited expressions. We have 3 of the exceptional single casks. 7 casks were announced that were released in Asia and America in the last few weeks. Created a lot of buzz on the internet here. A lot of people were kind of hunting them down. Very, very hard to come by because some of them only have a handful that will make their way into specific markets. But those are fantastic. Come from a single vintage, single cask, bottled at cask strength. Once again, natural color, unchill filtered whiskey. And then for the people who are looking for on that higher end of the collectible
If this
Macallans,
isn't enough.
If isn't enough, exactly. We have the Macallan 40-year-old, which is right now just hitting shelves in America. Only 70 bottles will hit the market here. So very small quantity in each of the key markets.
All 70 shelves.
Yes. So this has been extracted only from 3 casks.
Wow.
Yeah, very, very limited release. 465 bottles only, bottled at 44%. And beautiful, once again, dark natural color for the Macallan 40-year-old sherry oak.
That's awesome. Cool. So there's options for everybody, from $100 for the editions to
absolutely
ridiculous.
Yeah,
whatever floats your boat.
And if you want higher proof, we also have Classic Cut that's available right now. That's a 2017 limited release. Once it's done, it's gone.
All right, cool. So where can people reach you if people want to reach out to you? I know I reach out to you all the time.
Absolutely. I'm very easy to reach on Instagram. That's actually probably the easiest way to do. I'm at MacallanNicolas. That's Macallan. Put the N afterwards. I'm the first name to pop on top. You can actually just follow some of the new expressions that we're launching, some of the fancy bottles that we have on display all throughout America. Or if you want to send me a DM with some question, I'm always more than happy to answer them.
Always happy to answer. It's like the best part. So yeah, so if you guys have any other questions, comments, concerns, whatever it may be, go ahead and leave them in the comment section below and we'll get back to you.
Fantastic.
Maybe he'll get back to you. Who knows? I'll get back to you. More of this.